Gang, I want to thank you so much for tuning in with me here for episode number 59 of Talking About Horses. I'm joined today by special guest Daniel Dauphin of Dauphin Horsemanship. Today, we're going to talk about understanding bits, the how and the why bits function, that sort of thing. I met Daniel when we were both presenting at the Best Horse Practices Summit in Lexington, Kentucky back in 2022. His presentation on bits is one of the best that I've seen. He debunks a lot of the myths and misperceptions about their function. His information is grounded by science, common sense, and critical thinking. His material has been used at dozens of colleges and universities with equine programs. He also has a long-form podcast on which you may have heard me as a guest in 2024 that he calls Adult Onset Horsemanship. Daniel, I want to thank you so much for joining me and my audience today for episode 59 of Talking About Horses.
Well, thank you for having me, Patrick. I'm tickled to be here.
It's always a great opportunity when we get a chance to chat. So for folks that don't know you, that don't know who Daniel Dauphin is, give us the brief, sort of the elevator speech. We got a lot we want to talk about today, but give us the elevator speech of who is Daniel Dauphin.
So background in cutting horses, that's where I started out, mostly a colt starter and problem horse guy. About a dozen years ago, turned clinician, and in the process of turning clinician, figured I needed some bona fides out there to show that I knew what I was talking about, and I kind of randomly picked bits, did some YouTube videos on them. They took off, and now I'm the bit guy. So that's kind of how it went.
So what made you think about that? Like why I guess that's a big question for me. Why bits?
I've always been fascinated with them. I've part of my background is I spent a couple of years in college in mechanical engineering, so the physics and mechanics side of things is something I have an aptitude for and I really appreciate. But when I was doing the videos, I thought that was one of those subjects that there's just so much misinformation out there on. It would be pretty easy to stand out and have, this is really critically thought out. Most of the information out there is kind of a just take my word for it sort of a thing, and I really try to not just say things like that. It's all backed up. This is why and how it is like this. So that's kind of the approach I take, and seems to resonate somewhat. So
There you go. So not just because it says so on the card that's trying to sell you the bit. Is that what you're trying to say?
yeah, it's an amazing little facet of our industry where almost all of the information that is put out there about bits comes from someone who's wanting to sell you one. And that's just that's always one of those dangerous the salesman may not be the most credible information source in that stuff. So I've also made sure I'm not tied in any way with any bit maker company or anything like that. We've turned down sponsorship and all, so that the information comes first. There's no bias with it. We're not trying to push you a certain direction. We're just trying to give you the information and empower you to make your own good decisions and not fall for some of the gimmicks and the stuff you probably should have never bought that's going to wind up collecting dust on your tack room wall for the next 35 years. So,
Or worse than collecting dust, right? Causing problems.
yeah, yes, for
Yeah.
sure. Yep.
So take us back to when you first got started with horses at the beginning. Did you grow up with horses? Is that something that was you were just always involved with them? Was there a key turning point in young Daniel's life where he fell in love with horses and the fairy tales that we all tend to fall for, or what? Take us back there.
So I did not grow up with horses. I had a friend that had some horses when I was about 9 or so, and we went and rode a few times, and we rode a little bit more. I really started getting the horse bug when I was 12 or 13. I was reading all the Louis L'Amour westerns and all of that stuff, and I had to find out what a steel dust stallion really rode like and all of those things. And
Yeah.
about the time I was 14, that friend got his driver's license, and he and I started driving to the barn every day after school and going to ride. And so it strengthened in me, and I actually wound up buying my own first horse without my parents knowing about it when I was 15. He wound up being a trick horse. He would flip over backwards. And so I had to figure out how to not die and get him sorted out so my dad didn't find out about that and shoot him. So it was kind of baptism by fire on my part.
Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh. So that was the flipping over was something that was an issue that he came with, or was that something that you had to learn as a young Daniel the horseman?
No, he came with that. I got him from a legit horse trader, the kind I'm not sure really exists anymore, but the old man that's
Mm,
buying the horses for $300 at the sale barn and then flipping them. That was kind of where I got them, and I learned the hard way that he would flip over, and then it just became part of the pattern. It was like he was cold backed, but that was his thing. I would put my foot in the saddle by the time my butt hit
gotcha.
the seat. Here he came, and he'd do that 4, 5, 6 times every time I rode him. He'd get it out of his system, and then we would go. And I put so many miles on that horse, Patrick. I mean, I really enjoyed him and wore him out, but he did have that deal, and I actually got him fixed, but I was in college by that point. I suffered through that for
Oh, okay.
years until I kind of got a clue about what was going on. My friend and I rode a lot, but like we didn't know leads or anything. We thought going from point A to point B without falling
Yeah.
off was really high level stuff, going fast,
That
all
was a
the things
success.
kids do. So
Yeah.
yeah, we had a blast, but we didn't know near as much as we thought we knew. And that was before internet. There weren't resources out there at that point in time to learn like what people have access to now. So
Yeah.
just suffered through, and
Yeah.
I guess I had the hook in me deep enough that it stuck regardless of all the problems I was having to deal with.
There you go. That's good. And then when was it that you got started with riding cutting horses?
So that was in college. I had a couple of jobs in college. Actually, my first one was cleaning stalls at a halter horse barn, and then I got
Okay.
hired on. Louisiana Tech had a pretty strong equine program at that time. That's where I went to school, and that was all race horses. So believe it or not, when I was 18, 19, 20, I was an exercise rider standing on the top of race horses going 40 miles an hour around a track. Um,
Oh,
and
okay.
then from there, one of the colts that I started had gone to a cutting horse trainer, and he liked it and inquired who started it, and that kind of started. I worked for him for 4 years, all through college and a year after college, and then apprenticed under a couple other guys after that and everything.
Gotcha. So
So
you went to ride young
I've
horses then for the cutting trainer?
Yeah, yeah, he was a cutting horse trainer, but he also had a side of his business that was just colt starting. So he was running like 100 head of colts under me
Gotcha.
a year. I mean, if somebody had paid him for me to start a moose, then I'd have found a moose in the round pen when I came to work the next day. It didn't matter what was
There
coming
you
in.
go.
And I got a pretty good reputation for it, so before long, other trainers are sending him all their problems too, and I kind of have, I got a good scar collection, but learned a lot. I mean, um, and he wasn't, a lot of mentors in that kind of a setting would be maybe overly overly on top of you or critical or controlling, and he was definitely not that.
Mm.
He pretty well left me to my own devices. He knew he could fix anything I messed up. So but I could always go to him and ask questions. I was very ambitious. I pretty much had the first 2 weeks on anything that came in, and so if I wanted to learn how to put a handle on a horse, I had 2 weeks to figure out how to get him to turn around or back up, or all of those kinds of things, which I'm sure was pretty ugly for the first couple of years, but eventually it got a whole lot better, and I got where I could do some stuff. I didn't really do that much in the cutting side of his business other than starting colts, in terms of working cattle and
Okay.
that kind of stuff. But the next places that I went to
Yeah.
were it was pure cutting horse operations. So um,
Okay.
kept me on my toes. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. There you go. There you go. So you talk about how you evolved over the years with riding the young horses. What are some of the lessons, or some of the when you look back on that time? What are some of the things that stick out as maybe being big learning moments, or corners that you turned?
A few of the little sort of principles that I have, bumper sticker type things. I think of Colts a lot of times now, almost like a snake. He's more scared of you than you are of him, and you have to keep that in
Mm.
mind for a while there. I guess I didn't have enough empathy to realize I was the only one scared in the round pen. So um, getting
Okay.
getting that across and realizing if you just slow down, I mean that's the but there's just so many moments where if you will just stop and sit there for 10 seconds and let them process, all your
Mm.
problems will just magically melt away, and most people lack the ability to do that, and that's really when we say that you're going too fast, people don't really understand what we mean, but I think that's kind of what we mean a lot of times is you need to like
Mhm.
pause right there and just give him a second before you ask for the next thing. And I find like even today there's so many people that don't know how to just stop and sit on a horse without cueing him in some way. I mean, you'll
Without
work
doing
for that light
something.
bulb
Yeah.
moment, yeah, and you're like, okay, good. Next thing you know, they've turned left and gone off. Like, no, you were supposed to just sit there. Like, that was the
Right.
moment, and you ruined it. But
Yeah. You know, it
so,
reminds me of an old friend of mine who recently passed, Terry Helder, really great horseman. And he rode a lot of reining horses. And one of the things that he talked about was how he had at one point he quit smoking. He said when he was riding his young horses, if or any of his horses, if they'd give a really nice stop, he'd just sit there and he'd smoke a cigarette, right? And that gave them that time to
hmm
soak and think. And he said, well, there was that one time where I quit smoking cigarettes. He said, and these horses, they just weren't stopping for shit. Because he wasn't taking the time to sit and rest afterwards. He said, as soon as I picked up smoking again, they were stopping better. But it's that it's kind of like what you're saying here. It's that opportunity to just rest, right? Just let them soak. An analogy that I've heard that really makes a lot of sense to me is a horse is like a dry sponge, and when you dip it into a bucket of water, if you just dip it in fast and pull it back out, it's not going to soak much up, right? But the longer you let that sponge sit in the water, the more it's going to absorb, right? And I think that's such a great analogy for how horses can just learn by the sitting there and the waiting. It's I think it's Richard Winters talks about, if somebody were walking past and they saw you doing a whole lot with a horse, they think, well, there's a horse being trained. And if they walked by and you were just sitting on one, they'd say, well, they're not really doing much. And he says, but the truth is, it's the opposite, right? When you're
hmm
just sitting there on that horse, man, he's learning, hopefully. But yeah, that's such an important thing for people to think about is slow down and just wait, right? Yeah. So that's pretty cool. And so
yeah, the
where
really
did
good
that go
horseman.
from there? Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say the really good horsemen are usually pretty boring to watch. You could about fall asleep watching them do stuff, but I mean, at the end of the day, it's
Yeah.
a horse. So if they're not being real simple and real clear and real straightforward, then the horse is not gonna get it. So if it looks like some
Yep.
complex magic is happening, then probably nothing good is happening.
Yeah. Yeah. Well said. Absolutely. Absolutely. So then you went on to work with some of the other cutting horse trainers. Were there big key moments of learning with the other folks? I mean, I'm sure that there
There
were,
were
right?
some,
But are there any that
yeah.
really come to mind as like, oh, that's a keystone moment?
Yeah, the next guy I went to work for, he was a fairly young guy named Steve McCain, and he's actually not training horses anymore. But I really learned from him. That was when I started working horses on cattle more, and
Mm,
working them on cattle is pretty intense. That's really where it starts to become the pressure cooker sort of a thing.
mm,
And I would say he was really good at giving them moments to just be a horse. Every horse got turned out on the weekends. They were out in paddocks. Um, he had no problem. We were background in cattle, as a lot of cutting horse operations are. Their background in cattle in order to have the cattle to work. So I used the 2 year olds to doctor and handle all the cattle. And so it wasn't nearly as strict and regimented as a lot of barns might be. If you're thinking of a strict training operation, there was a whole lot of letting them decompress and kind of just be a horse. And at that point, I'm still young, in my early to mid 20s, and I didn't appreciate what long-term pressure could do to a horse. I'd only worked with young horses. I hadn't really dealt with too many
Mm,
older, burned out show horses yet, and so you get to appreciate that they need to unwind and they need to chill and there needs to be time off. So when I'm coming from like everything I'd ridden before that was maybe going to try to kill me. And so you got a very defensive sort of a mindset. And now it's
mm-hmm.
really, you're going to have a long-term relationship with this animal and you're going to get to know it a lot better and it's going to get to know you. And so you got to relax a little. You can't stay so wound tight and intense and it's not life
Right.
and death every second. And so that was another pretty good awakening for me
Yeah.
in
So when you
terms
talk
of the
about time under
mentality of a
pressure,
horse.
right, right. When you talk about time under pressure, for listeners that might not be sure what that means, talk to us about that. The pressure that those horses are under, or horses in general in training.
Yeah, so I mean, you have expectations and standards, and whether we like it or not, there are timelines involved, and so you're we even refer to them as crops. You're trying to kind of bring this whole group of horses up to a point
Mm,
so that they're ready for whatever this deadline is, and as however people may feel about that, that's just the reality of the situation. And so you wind up with your high flyers. You also have your kind of lower end horses that aren't doing as well and maybe need a little extra help, or you see the conversations where you have to tell a owner, I'm sorry, but this one just isn't cut out for this. It's not gonna make it. And that was always tough for me. We would have that group of 2 year olds. Like at Steve's, I was probably riding 32 year olds, and then come spring of the 3 year old year, that whittles down to like a dozen. So um,
mm,
you really kind of you see that standard we're looking for, and that some meet it and some don't, or they don't meet it on the timeline. And so there is that pressure involved both on us and then transmitted to the horses to keep that continuous level of progress. And I've seen plenty of horses that like stagnated for 6 months and you kind of just do what you do, and you let them grow up and all of a sudden they have a light bulb week, and next thing you
mm.
know they're caught up with the group. But I've seen a whole bunch that the light bulb never comes around and they never make that step up that you need them to make
Yeah, never
as
transition from
well.
that plateau.
Yeah, and I've always been pretty proud. Like I don't have a bunch of reject blown up horses out there. I always felt like if they weren't going to make it in this thing we were aiming toward, they should still have a solid background and be able to transition into something else. It's not it shouldn't be a do or die kind of a scenario.
Mm-hmm.
I've had to fix way too many of those horses that have been through that kind of stuff to um, want to have any of that on my resume myself. So I'm pretty cautious about
Right.
that. It's not the end of the world. We don't need to ruin a horse's life or anything just because they didn't quite make the cut of whatever plan someone arbitrarily had in their head for that horse.
Right. Exactly. Exactly. So when was it that you kind of went out on your own and started making a career out of this?
So I worked for Steve for a year. I went to Mississippi and I managed a ranch up there for a non-pro owner for a year. And then I went to Weatherford, Texas and worked out there for almost a year. So by the time I was really out on my own, I was probably 27, something like that. I
Okay.
guess I'd spent a full 6 years apprenticing other trainers, and then about a year managing that ranch. I was still training horses at the ranch, but I got to show a little bit at that place. That place actually had shows,
Oh, okay.
so I got to see a lot of that and kind of really. I've never I used to get really, really nervous at that point in time. When I would go show, I wouldn't be able to tell you what color the three cows I had just worked were. Couldn't
Gotcha.
tell you what my name was, kind of just black out when I go in the arena.
Yeah, the
So
performance
that
pressure of
wasn't
it.
for me.
anxiety.
Yeah, yeah. And I've since gotten where I can do things in front of a crowd now that doesn't bother me at all. But at that point,
Right.
wasn't for me for sure. So
Yeah. Was there was there a moment, was there a line that you felt like that was when the clarity came in, that you didn't have those, massive saber-toothed butterflies anymore, or was it just a gradual progression?
um, I would say that's hard to pinpoint. I I haven't really shown in cutting since. So kind of my last
Okay.
appearance in a cutting horse setting, I was still butterflies. Um, then I went out on my own and I really changed direction and then went into the clinician setting. And so kind of the next time I was really doing stuff in front of a crowd, it wasn't doing cutting horses anymore. It was doing the clinic thing. And actually, so my first like expo that I went to, I got a little kind of got set up here. It was a colt
Hmm.
starting competition. They invite three of us, and my instructions are I need to bring a horse and I have to do a freestyle reining demonstration to music, which is not something I've ever done. Like musical choreography is
Oh,
not why I got into training horses. So
okay.
um, I work on that. I show up to it, and neither of the other guys brought a horse at all, and one of them didn't even show up for his demonstration time, so they asked me to stretch and fill.
Oh
So
no!
that was kind
Out of
of
the frying pan into the
baptism.
fire.
Yeah, but the good thing is I spent so much time in front of a crowd at that deal, even though I was nervous at the beginning. Like adrenaline can only stay for so long, right? So I was good
Right.
and relaxed by the time we got to the end of it. So
You were plenty flooded by the end.
yeah, yeah.
There you go. Oh man. Well, I tell you what, it was really refreshing to hear you talk about how long you spent with mentors. I think you said 6 years or something like that.
Mhm.
That's something that we don't hear a lot about. It seems like in our sort of microwave world now, there's so much this idea of, I've watched this video, I've ridden a couple horses, I'm going to go out and be a professional trainer. And obviously I'm simplifying it, and I don't mean to offend anybody that that's the approach that they took, but it's less and less that we hear about folks that have spent a lot of time with a mentor. How do you feel like that prepared you for working with the public's horses and working with the public, the people themselves?
I think it's absolutely an integral part of it. I don't see how you can bypass that and get very far. And in a couple of different ways. Like you don't realize it, but not only are you learning to train horses in that setting, but you're also watching them deal with customers and the industry trends, and you're learning about relationships between trainers and how horse trades and sales and things go. And there's just a whole lot of the behind the scenes stuff it's never really organized for you or like handed out, but you just get to observe it long enough that you have some idea of what's going on and the ability to build contacts and all of that so that when you go out on your own, you've got a network of people you can call or who know you, and that way if you need to sell a horse or something, you got a potential to do that. But on the horse side of it, I mean, I stayed with that for 6 years. um I get a little miffed sometimes. We have some of these uh short-term programs to learn to be a trainer and get a certificate or whatever kind, and then people think in 3 months or in 6 months like they're a horse trainer, and it's just kind of like, no, it takes a lot longer than that. You need to. I think you and I had a conversation one time that we both have scars on our calves from riding young colts and stuff, and that's kind of lit. Like if you're a horse trainer, like pull up your pants and let me see your calf scars. How many horses have
Where's
we
the boot rub?
actually?
Yeah,
Yeah. So
exactly.
um because that's just, we talk about horses needing wet saddle pads, but I mean trainers need to have a whole bunch of horses under their belt too. That's
Hmm.
another part of it. So
Hmm.
gotta gotta learn to deal with the different personalities and all of that stuff, unless you're just in a very very specific niche, but not many of us do that or stay. You and I both have like who would look at me and think this guy rode racehorses a long time ago, right? So um, we all have kind of our cross training things that we've gotten into. So
Mm-hmm.
you got to have that experience. You got to learn how to deal with a dull horse, a hot horse, a scared one, the one that maybe needs to be a little more scared of people, all of the different mixes that you're going to come across out there.
Right.
So
Right. Yeah,
anyway,
there's
best to
so
do
much,
that
and
when
I think
someone's watching. I was just going to say,
th-
best to do all of that and experience those things when someone who has the experience is watching and can kind of say, hey,
mm,
that's not going to work right there. You need to do something
yeah,
different there, so.
right, right. Yeah, it can be so problematic when we see somebody who's um only worked with a very small handful of horses, right? And they when they don't have the mentor, they're kind of inside an echo chamber, right? They're only hearing their perspective about a thing, right? So just like you said, having somebody else watching that's got more experience that can say, "Hey, you should have done this, or you should think about that," or things like that. I think that's so important for us. So, and this is just off the top of my head here, but thinking where you're coming from right now, if you were to go back to young Daniel, fresh stepped away from those mentors even, what sort of advice would you give him? Or what would you tell him to
Um,
change about what he's doing? Do a little more of this, or geez, stop doing that. Is there anything that sticks out?
I would have probably said slow down and relax a little bit more. Like there's no race. I was pretty intense as a young fella, and so I needed to chill out a little bit and let the ambition go by just a hair. I would also say that clearly to be the biggest flaw career wise for me is that it took me 25 years to realize that this isn't a horse business, it's a people business. And I was kind of training horses to get away from people, and like that's just, I know I'm not the only one, but the skills
Uh-huh.
on the people side are every bit as important. And some horse trainers, if you're purely training horses, you still need to understand that. But like in the clinician game, like this is way more a people deal than it is a horse deal. So you
Absolutely.
gotta get that figured out, which is a whole different kettle of fish than the horse thing.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know about
Mm-hmm.
you. I can train a horse or a dog a lot easier than I can train a person.
Right. Yeah, and it's like you say, the it is a people business. The horses aren't the ones writing the checks, right? The horses
Mhm.
aren't the ones emailing you or calling you or trying to book a spot in your clinic or a spot in the barn for training. It's a people business. The horses are the conduit, right, for that. But it is when you're a trainer for a profession, it's a people business for sure. And anybody who thinks otherwise, they just they may be in for a rude awakening, right? But you do hear that a
Mhm.
lot. You hear, I want to be a horse trainer because I don't like to deal with people. It's like, I don't know. That's probably not the place for you then, because that says your people skills aren't very good, and you got to have pretty darn good people skills to be in this business and to get very far. Uh, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I
Uh,
talent with a horse is not the thing. I know too many people that aren't all that talented with a horse but are pretty successful, and I know a whole bunch
mhm,
that are really talented with a horse but nobody knows who they are. And so
right.
unfortunately the skills with a horse thing is not the magic sauce that makes all of this work from a career
Hmm.
perspective anyway.
Right. Right. Yeah. I think it's important to have that balance, right? It really is important to have that balance. So, so we said that as things evolved, you got more into the bits side of things, and I know that that's not all that you teach. So, let's before we talk specifically about bits, let's talk about what else. I feel like people hear Daniel Dauphin and they think, oh, the bit guy, right? And I know I'm guilty of promoting you as that, because I'm like, hey, you guys, if you want to learn about bits, you got to talk to Daniel. Like that's certainly become, I don't know if it was on purpose or not, but that's certainly become something that you've been recognized uh, for being a voice of reason, and somebody who really knows their stuff when it comes to bits. But what else is it that you do?
So I still start some colts and deal with some problem horses. I'm not a full-time training operation. Obviously, I travel a fair bit and also, so I'm not here all the time to deal with that, but I do still do some of that. We do virtual lessons and clinics and things. So that's really kind of since COVID started.
Mm,
In fact, I called them video lessons before, but that was basically you would send me a video and I would edit it and voice over and tell you, you'd go back and watch it. And now we're doing live stuff just like this
yeah.
all the time. I actually do a fair bit of that these days. And then, um, well, I guess that's all I'll say about that. So I do still train horses, and I can still help you load one in a trailer and all of those kinds of things. But the bit thing does seem to be my niche, and I see a need for it. And I guess the first thing I'll say about that is what I do talk about isn't just about bits. It's much more comprehensive, and it's about how you use your hands and the psychology, and there's
Mm,
way more to the picture than just the bit. In fact, like probably 3/4 of the time when people contact me having air quotes bit problems, when we get down to the brass tacks of it doesn't really have anything to do with the bit that they're using at all. Um, so that's a I guess that's kind of a misnomer. I don't mind being the bit guy, but the reality is bit problems are often not bit problems. That's just the way that it goes.
yeah.
So, um, and then now we have a video, the one you were talking about originally, that's in some about 25 universities and all. That was a project I started 7 or 8 years ago. I decided to take the YouTube videos and kind of put them on steroids. So I really went and did some hardcore research and built some props and things. And I spent about 3 years doing that video. And then here last year, we took that and we amped it up into an online course. So the original video is 5.5 hours long, but that was because I had to fit it on 4 DVD discs, and we're now kind of technologically beyond DVDs, which gave me the ability to, time wasn't the relevant factor anymore. So I was able to take a lot of stuff I had to edit out to fit on 4 discs. And now we can kind of go a little more into the nooks and crannies and some of those topics that I want to talk about. But just, some things aren't really important to everyone, and it takes 30 minutes to fully explain them. And so if you're going to have to put something on the
Right.
editing floor, that's the kind of thing that you don't talk about, but
Yeah.
like we're doing certifications through that where people can be a certified bidding consultant. And if you're going to go out there and do that with my name attached to you, I want you to know what the heck you're talking about
Mm.
in pretty much all instances. So it's
Even
it's
that
really
30
really
minutes you didn't think
comprehensive.
you were interested in. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, like, to be honest, I probably spend 20 minutes talking about curb chains, and there is way more
Mhm.
change to be made in the way a bit feels in a horse ride by adjusting the curb and putting a different type on there than people have any. Like, if I always talk about this when we talk about what this bit does and all. Well, if you think that's what that does, what if I put a bag over the horse's mouth and you couldn't see the bit and you had to go ride and then tell me what was going on? Is it enough of an effect that you would know a D ring from an egg butt? And if you don't,
Ah,
then does it really matter? you know?
there you
And
go.
so, like, if you let me play around with your curb, I'll have you riding the same bit 3 different rides, and you'll think it's something totally different each time. It really,
Mm.
so there's a lot of little things like that we can play with. Um, and if you understand how and why, then you can start to color outside the lines a little bit, but you're not doing it randomly or arbitrarily. You really have an idea of what we can expect or how this should play out.
Hmm. Hmm. So you talk about the research that you did as you were over the course of those 3 years, as you were putting together the bidding video. Talk to us a little bit about that research that you did. Who were you making references with? Who were you collaborating with, learning from? Where did your research take you? Talk to us about that.
So, first I contacted a couple of bit makers that I knew and a couple of vets. I had a contact, um, it's Dr. Jeff Tucker. He's a Cornell graduate veterinarian, but he's been specializing in equine dentistry since the mid 90s. And this, about a year ago, he passed his 80,000th dental on a horse. So
Oh, so he's
you
done a
talk
few.
about people that are, yeah. So he's got, he's one of those people whose opinion weighs a little more than other opinions you might hear out there.
Sure.
And then I called some vet school professors, and it was kind of just wherever my curiosity was. I had two engineers that were involved in the project where I talk about the physics and the mechanics. Because to be
Yeah.
honest, there's about six things in there where we're breaking new ground, and you're not going to hear that point made anywhere else in any other source. But there's a lot of things in there where we're busting kind of a myth of what you're going to commonly hear and explaining why it doesn't actually work
Hmm.
that way. Um, and some of that I think is important. Some of the things that you hear are they're complete opposite of the reality of the situation. But that placebo effect is strong. If you're convinced that this is supposed to do that, then your brain will select to see what you think you're supposed to see, and
Yeah.
you
What's
get
the
into
what's the phrase?
trouble there.
Believing is seeing.
hmm
Yeah.
Um, and we get pretty deep into body language of the horse. So I like to think of it as true acceptance or rejection of the bit,
Mm.
because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter whether I'm happy or validated or whatever. The horse is the final judge, and so you need to be able to read the horse, and then that's what tells you whether you are being successful or not. And there are, like, I'll flat out admit, I'm trying to give kind of the highest percentage. This is how it works out most of the time, but there definitely are horses that are
Mm.
outliers that just don't follow the rules, and you may still have to play around a little bit, but 98% of the time this will work. So that's
Yeah.
kind of how we're coming at it. But I do want you to be able to evaluate the horse yourself and know whether they're cool with everything. And so we talk a lot about that, because there are some things out there that we just dogmatically have wrong. What we think this means, it
Mm.
absolutely doesn't mean. So
What are some of the biggest myths that you busted? What are some of those biggest, dogmas that you've found to be wrong?
um, well, the single biggest one is the foamy mouth deal. That
Mm.
is really, so, like talking to the vet school professors and all. I realized when I was getting into that and trying to search different topics, there are a bunch of things with horses that the research just hasn't been done. We can't conclusively say this, but we can kind of see that there's a direction or a trend. Um, in some of those instances, I turn to the human world. So believe it or not, two of the most helpful people that I had involved in that project on horses were actually human speech pathologists,
Mm.
because they are
Yeah.
experts in the tongue and swallowing and how that stuff plays out. And there are differences in the anatomy of a horse's throat and a human's throat, but there are
Hmm.
similarities. So there are some things there where we're drawing a conclusion, and I'm trying to be pretty upfront about that. Like, this is not conclusively proven, but as far as evidentially, we can do this over and over again to a few hundred horses, and it will work out this way every time, I promise. So you can, if that's as
Yeah.
close to take my word for it as I could get. But again, if you practice this, read your horse will tell you that worked. So um
Hmm.
and so that's one of the biggest kind of debunked myths is the foamy mouth. And I also
So
talk a
what's
lot in
the
there
for
about, like,
listeners that
the
maybe aren't sure about that? What is that thought about the foamy mouth, and how did you disprove it?
so yeah, the specific saying is that a foamy mouth is a wet mouth, and a wet mouth is a good mouth, right? You've probably heard that a million times,
Hmm.
seen it in graffiti in the bathrooms at all the arenas and all that good stuff. Um, so I look at it kind of backwards. Why is a wet mouth a good mouth? And the real answer to that, and this was this was a 2.5 year journey coming to this, to be able to say the sentence I'm about to say. The reason a wet mouth is a good mouth is because it indicates that the horse is swallowing. And that is really what it all comes down to. If we have
Okay.
true function of the horse's mouth, the tongue is working like it should, the hyoid is doing what it's supposed to do, all of the other things down the line from that happen, then that is a horse that will still be freely swallowing at a normal rate. And this would be one of the most common things that we see in terms of dysfunction in horses. We will offend the tongue generally, and then they get braced up and tense and they stop swallowing. And obviously if they're not swallowing, we will have saliva that isn't going where it's supposed to go, and then we start to see that on the outside of the mouth. There are a few reasons why it can turn foamy, because I don't know how in depth you want to get on that here, but some of that
Well,
can
give us the
actually
30
even be
second
causing.
version.
What's that?
Oh, I said give us the 30-second version. I don't want to.
Okay. Yeah, so part of it's postural. We talk a lot about riding behind the vertical and some of the things that that leads to. And so, like, if I can have no effect in my life other than that, if we got rid of foamy mouths and riding behind the vertical, like, I could die a happy man. That would pretty much be um, because the foamy mouth really does show a lot of dysfunction. And I sent you a link if people want to check it out. I have a 30-minute free video that is just on that topic, which is
Yeah.
like, I, I'm not known for brevity, so I like to get comprehensive and do the whole thing. So if y'all are interested in that, you can go to this link and watch a 30-minute video on it.
There
But
we go. And for those of you that are listening after the live broadcast airs, that's thebitcourse.com/foamy hyphen mouth. So
yeah,
perfect. Well then,
um,
so we're saying then that the foamy mouth is not necessarily a good thing, not ever a good thing. What kind of a distinction do we have?
I would say pretty much ever. It's always an indication of dysfunction. Now, what I'll say here is like lipstick. Okay,
Okay.
so
Mm-hmm.
much more minor sort of a foamy mouth. That's not like a huge red flag to me. I kind of view that it's almost like the glass over a fire extinguisher. There are going to be days when you're going to need to handle your horse a lot, right? That's just the way that it goes. And so if I'm having one of those days and I need to break the glass over the fire extinguisher, then so be it. But if I'm having a fire every single day, that would be a problem. I would want to adjust some things that I'm doing. Maybe I'm trying to push this horse a little too fast, or I got a little too goal oriented and I missed comfort being step one. We didn't include comfort as we continued on down the road. Something is amiss in the equation that we usually need to kind of stop and reevaluate a little bit about what we're doing. So
Okay. Okay. So the lipstick is not a big danger sort of a thing. Um,
it's
you're
yeah,
not a
it's not a
fan of
huge one.
the big massive wads of rabid looking slobber hanging out of a horse's mouth and running down their legs and
No, I can't really even look at that anymore. Like it's I have to kind of turn my head because I know too much about what it really means. And part of it, so you mentioned on their legs and stuff. Part of that is the parotid salivary gland, which releases a protein called latherin, which is also excreted in sweat. So if we're looking at like an endurance horse or an eventer that just went, 45 minutes over a course or something, they're going to have latherin present. And so where the bridle's rubbing the cheeks and, there is going to be foam in certain areas. But if we're consistently in just little arena rides dinking around seeing foam dripping out of the mouth, then yeah, that's a billboard that is blaze orange as far as I'm concerned. That's definite dysfunction going on.
mm-hmm. Okay, interesting. And so, uh, and I'm trying to think here. I would say I've seen plenty of horses, even riding in a hackamore, that show the lipstick when we talk about it, a little
Mhm.
bit of the foam at the edges of their mouth. So it's not necessarily when we talk about it being a dysfunction, it's not necessarily. Am I understanding right? We can't then say it's just the bit that's causing that
Correct.
dysfunction, right?
Correct. Like, so for instance, if you were to, like, where the parotid, and I know we're on a podcast here, so I'm just going to say where the parotid salivary gland resides
Mm-hmm.
is, if you had a horse kind of flex vertically, it's sort of between the atlas and the back of the jaw, just below the ear. So it's in
Mm-hmm.
an odd place there. And as the horse gets more and more behind the vertical, you're overly compressing that salivary gland. And you can even reach, I do see horses where you have chronic inflammation there. And so
Mm-hmm.
they're in a state of distress constantly. Even when you're not riding them back in the stall, they're still going to have inflammation there. And so that's a scenario you can still cause with a bitless bridle, riding in a halter, whatever you
Mm-hmm.
may want to say. So if you're kind of overworking the parotid and causing inflammation there, that is a situation where you could still see lipstick or something like that. You're obviously not in a position there to highly offend the tongue, so you may not be as
Mm-hmm.
interfering with swallowing as you might have been if a bit had been in the horse's mouth, but it still would be an indication of some problems, you know. So
Gotcha. Gotcha. So as a horse is learning, and I'm trying to think of the sort of middle of the road with this, and just clarification for myself and for other people listening. Uh, as a horse is learning, and you're having that conversation where sometimes they're out of balance, sometimes they come behind the vertical, sometimes they're a little heavier in the rein. Uh, are those the pieces that you're talking about as maybe moments of dysfunction? So if I guess in other words, what I'm trying to
mhm.
say is, if we see lipstick, does it mean the whole ride was crap, or does it? I'm picturing in my mind that it could depend, right? And it would depend on what the horse maybe learned from the ride, from the scenario or the situation, or is it just all bad?
No, I would say that it depends. Like, lipstick doesn't really offend me too much.
Okay.
And there, I'm going to say here, I've worked with some horses where a lot of people don't realize this, but if you work in dysfunction enough, you're actually going to cause nerve damage. So, like, a really good case of that, if we see some of these horses that have the tongue outside the mouth, always hanging on the left side or something, that's
Mm-hmm.
generally
Mm-hmm.
a nerve damage problem or severe dysfunction in the hyoid or something like that. But you have something physiologically really not working at that point. And so
Mm-hmm.
if we were even in the more minor stages of that, we still can have dysfunction. We could now have a rider doing everything perfectly and setting everything up perfectly, and the horse now comfortable. But because they've got some long-term damage there, this is kind of as good as it's ever going to be at this point. You know,
Gotcha.
almost like a stroke victim that gets
Mm-hmm.
80% of their speech back, but they still maybe slur just a little, or and that's just
Mm-hmm.
where they're going to be now.
Yeah, that
The unfortunate
irreversible
reality
damage
is
at that
there's,
point.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So,
Yeah.
um, so that's a big part of what I'm trying to do is just make people aware. Like, the tongue it is so communicative and sensitive. People just don't really appreciate what's really going on there when you have contact with the tongue in a horse's mouth. It's the only part of the entire body involved in three of the five senses. There's an entire
Mm-hmm.
developmental stage, like with children. If you've ever raised a toddler, there's like a 3 month period in their life where all you say to them is, "Don't put that in your mouth." And the
Yeah.
reason that you're doing that is because at that stage in all mammals they have to suckle, and so they have the tongue and the
Mm-hmm.
swallowing reflex at birth. And your mouth is actually more neurologically wired in a human, for instance, than their hands and their eyes until they're over a year old. And so if they want to learn what this is, the best thing they can do is put it in their mouth, and their tongue and their palate will tell them what this is, what the texture is: cold, hot, hard, soft, rough, smooth, all of the different
Mm-hmm.
things. One of the little demos I'll do, I'll hold up like a walnut and a marker to a pin, and I'll say, everybody in the room looking at these two objects, you know exactly what this would feel like if you put this in your mouth.
Yeah.
And so the tongue is not something that needs to be screamed at. It is super, super, super communicative and sensitive.
Mhm.
And if you're just aware of that, then you've got a much better shot of getting along with your horse. Um, I try to tell people, like, if we're riding in contact, as I'm sure a lot of your riders are doing, what most people think contact is actual contact with the bars of the mouth, where we have completely compressed all of the soft tissues. And if you just started to go slower and become aware when you're picking those reins up very slowly, when you first make contact with the lip, and then you make contact with the tongue, and then you begin to compress them, if that became something you were very aware of, you're about to level up 2 notches in the next month. I mean,
Yeah,
like, it's
would
going to
change everything.
totally change the way you ride. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I
So
remember you
that's kind
mentioned.
of why
I
I
don't
say,
remember if it was a post that you made or in the discussion at the best horse practices where you asked the question of what's the first place that the horse feels the contact when you pick up on the rein, and it was the lip. And of course, everybody was thinking, tongue or bar or pole or whatever, depending on the bit that they're using. And lip was, yeah, folks don't often think about that.
it's, yep,
Yeah.
it's the
Yeah.
lip.
So
Yep.
we've actually got a couple
And,
questions that have come in here, Daniel, that I think are great to touch on at this point, if you don't mind. So Tanya has asked a question. So no moist mouth at all. Is it supposed to be dry? Or let's clarify that for Tanya.
yes. So what you want is a horse with normal mouth function. Okay, that's what I'm looking for. If we do something that causes it to be abnormal, that's the red flag. So a horse should be salivating, but they should also be using their tongue normally and swallowing. So I don't want a dry mouth. That's not the same thing. In fact, a dry mouth, like, I don't want to get too much into this, but one of the things that will happen if we force a horse into the sympathetic nervous system is the digestion stops. And so if we do that for a prolonged period with a horse, that's how you get the dry mouth, because they ceased salivation at all. Okay. So that also would be a red flag. And in fact, I really want a bit. I'm big into the metallurgy and all of that. I like the sweet iron with copper inlay. Any bit with two different metals in it will have a galvanic effect. It's literally a battery in the horse's mouth that will stimulate salivation, because I want to trigger them to swallow pretty much as often as I can get them. I want them to swallow at least about once every 2 minutes. And so
Okay.
if they're swallowing, I definitely shouldn't have saliva outside of the mouth. But I do want saliva present. That tells me my horse is in a learning frame of mind. And if they're relaxed enough to be using the tongue and swallowing, like, we're actually getting something done on this ride, and my horse doesn't hate me.
There you go. There you go. Perfect. Now, in talking about the tongue, Anne's got a great question for us here. And I'm not sure particularly if she's talking about the horse that she's riding. I do know Anne and the horse she's riding. He happens to be an off the track thoroughbred. Don't know if that's going to make any difference in your answer or not, but I wanted to put that out there because I think a lot of times context is important. So she wants to know any reasons why a bridled horse might stick his tongue out even with a looped rein and genuinely soft contact.
Yes. So generally, I would look at that as a release of pressure. It would kind of depend on whether it's like a singular type yawn and they're playing around, or whether it's like, you could tell a difference if it's anxiety ridden and they're like trying to spit this thing out of their mouth and get rid of this, right? So those wouldn't be the same thing, wouldn't mean the same thing. But if I was working with a horse that was having some of these bit problems, part of what I'm going to look for to show improvement is that horse is going to yawn, stick their tongue out. They're basically stretching the hyoid apparatus and all the mechanisms. The hyoid is tied into the whole body. There's literally fascia going from your horse's tongue to his hocks. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
that's all connected, which is part of why it's all about the tongue. If you cause tension in the tongue, it just radiates straight through that horse. I mean, to the point, I can watch a horse. I could watch you 100 feet away loping around or something, and I can tell whether you have tongue problems by the way the horse moves, or the way the neck looks, whether the shoulders are free, because
Mm-hmm.
it affects the whole chain on down the line. So
Mm-hmm.
Um,
So with that, if you
so
kind of following that line backwards, let's say we're working and we help a horse to release tension in their body elsewhere. Will you then see that reflected in the tongue?
that is an excellent question, and I'm very glad that you asked that way. So yes, the tongue or the mouth is simply a very expressive part of the horse. So just because we see something going on at the mouth does not necessarily mean that what we're seeing is tied to the mouth. So you could have a
Yeah.
horse that's showing anxiety with a bit because his right hock is sore or something like that. And that just happens to be where and how he's expressing it, because they don't have hands and thumbs and all this stuff to go, hey,
Mm-hmm.
wait, so there's only so many ways that they can do that, and the mouth is one of their very, very expressive spots. So again, that's kind of what I'm saying. When we're looking for bit problems, sometimes bit problems aren't really what we find that that's actually just an expression of some other thing.
Mm-hmm.
you know
Yeah.
so
Sometimes it's
very good
the
question.
dashboard indicator rather than the actual
Hmm.
place of the problem. Yeah, that makes a lot of
Absolutely.
sense. That makes a lot of sense. A question came in from Carla that I think is really interesting, and I'd actually love to sort of turn the conversation this way for a moment, if you don't mind. And Carla asks, knowing everything that you know now, are you still using bits? And so then the question goes on, if so, when and how do you introduce the bit? But that's a question that I see come up all the time. If we know this much about how the bits function, why still use the bit? So I want to go to that question first, and then I want to talk about how and when you introduce a bit to a horse, and that's something that Tanya has asked also, about how you would approach introducing a bit to a youngster. But knowing what we know about bits and how much of an influence that has on the body, why do we use bits? Why do we still use bits? Or why do
The
you
answer
specifically?
is,
I'm not going to talk about, the king's we, right, as everyone, but why does Daniel Dauphin still use bits knowing what he knows?
the answer is in the question. It's because they have such an influence on the body. And so if I'm looking for subtlety of communication, which I am, that's the place to do it. Um, and the nose is fine. Like I have nothing against hackamores and bosals and however you want to go there, but it simply isn't as sensitive as the mouth, and thus I can't be as subtle on it. And if I'm looking to be subtle, like that picture I always have in my mind is that person riding the horse. Hopefully it's me, and you can't really ever see them cue the horse. It's just like they go together,
Mm,
and then they change directions and they stop or they whatever. But it's like there's no cues being given. They're just moving off as one. That's subtlety, and that's what I'm looking for. And because the tongue is so sensitive, if I can appreciate that sensitivity and learn to communicate with it, that's the place to be. That's why you just simply won't have that same level of sensitivity on the nose or any other place we tend to cue a horse. So um
mm-hmm,
and the emotional, like I can feel if my horse gets a little anxious. I mean, I can feel that between my legs, but I can feel that through the bridle as well, because that mouth is a place of expression. So if I've got a handhold right on it, like that's
mm-hmm,
an first opportunity to figure out what's going on there, to kind of feel that horse's feelings through my reins. The biggest problem, just I mean, it's not even there's not even a close second. We are not aware enough of our hands and what's actually happening through those reins. That's we
yeah,
could talk about mechanics and all of that stuff, and I do, but like what I was just talking about, if you learn to pick up the reins and feel the lip and feel the tongue and feel when you've compressed those, like you should almost never get to bar pressure.
mm,
You just really shouldn't. There may be moments where you have to, but it should be a 1% of the time, not not most of the time. And
right,
so
right.
if you just have that awareness, really and truly, what bit you're riding with won't matter nearly as much anymore.
Yeah, I think that's a really great way to say it, and it's so important for us to have that awareness that we can't. I think from every perspective, when it comes to horsemanship, awareness is one of the most important things, whether we're talking about bitting or, shoeing a horse or fitting the saddle or, using a leg aid or, whatever it is. Your awareness is the most, one of maybe the most important pieces of that, right? Because if you're going at it without that awareness, well, then it almost doesn't matter what you or the horse are doing, because you're not going to get anything good out of it. And if you do, you won't be able to replicate it because you weren't aware of what it was.
Um, so do you want to move to the second part of that question now, or do you want to talk more about that?
Yeah, I definitely want to go to the second part of that question. So when and how would you introduce the bit? What would be your approach?
So the win is pretty much when I'm working with a horse and I feel like I can get a bridle on them without a big fight. So some of the colts that come into me aren't even halter broke, and obviously I can't put a bit on them right then and there. But once I
Okay.
can, I have a bit, I call it the hanging bit. It's just a little O-ring snaffle, and it's on a piece of string, and I just put it on them. I adjust it rather loosely, and they wear that while I'm doing groundwork. So that's how I introduce the bit to a young horse. And I do like it to be pretty loose. I am truly looking for the horse to pick the bit up and suck on it and hold it. That's all a really key thing of getting the mouth seal developed and really getting that relationship going. With 95% of the colts that I've started, we have that accomplished in about 10 minutes without really working on it. We just put the bit in their mouth. We start doing a little groundwork. I'm focusing on that. I'm not paying attention to the bit. Neither is the horse. And
Mm-hmm.
next thing you know,
Mm-hmm.
they're standing there holding it like we've been riding them for 6 years.
Yeah.
So that's how I
Yeah.
go
I've always
about.
found movement to be
Yeah.
really helpful to them when you first introduce them to the bit, rather than letting them stand around and focus on that and get obsessed
Mm,
about this new thing in my mouth. I've always found that moving them around, and if you're already under saddle, right, just riding them and let them go forward, let them carry it around and just go around the arena or down the trail or something like that. Do you find that's a helpful thing? That's why the movement is so important?
I think so. Yeah. Like I don't typically tie colts up with a bit in their mouth and let them just play with it
Okay.
for 3 hours, because they're going to tend to develop. I have no control over what the relationship with that bit may be. And I may now have hours worth of reinforced playing to deal with after.
Mm-hmm.
So I kind of also think of it like this too. I want a horse to develop a little bit of a work ethic, and I know we could unpack that concept at length too. But I'm just looking for them to associate when we have got a bridle on and a saddle on, we're working. When we have those things off, we're not working. So if I just rode you and now you've been washed off and tied and you're getting a chill, we're not working. And so the bit's not in your mouth at that moment either. Now you can relax. None of my training stuff is on you. You get to just be you at this point. So
Mm-hmm.
I try to be pretty careful about what those associations we're forming with those objects is.
Yeah, I think that's a really great way to say that you want to be on the controlling side or the influential side of the associations with it, right? So rather than just put the bit on and leave them in their stall to I'll say to dink with it, to wear it, to mess around with it, you want to be in that space where you're saying, when you have that, think about this, and then they relax into that, right? As they go, they relax into that idea of carrying the bit. I think that's a really important distinction for a lot of people, because I think it is still a common thing to think about, let them wear it and leave them alone, let them to their own devices. Um, and I have myself, I've always found that if you can get them busy thinking about their body, then they become more understanding of the ability to carry the bit and feeling the influence that it can have over their body. Yeah. Yeah. Nice. I like that.
Absolutely.
I like that. Very good. So I want to touch on this just for a moment, just because it can be such a hot topic, and why not? Why not cover it here? Um, Hate mail goes to Daniel at Daniel Dauphin Horsemanship. No, I'm kidding. So nose bands, and we may have known that we were going to go there. Nose bands.
Mhm.
We've got now the FEI is just releasing their new, you know, door stopper, bit checker, nose band, adjustment checker. What do you think? You talk about full functioning of the mouth as being
Hmm.
important when it comes to the bit. Or you may have worded that a little bit different, but that's what we've got right here. So the fully functioning of the mouth. When it comes to a noseband, what are your thoughts on nosebands, noseband adjustment?
Um, so I'm not going to give you a short answer on this. Okay, I'm gonna unpack this a little bit. Um,
Okay.
Generally, I'm against.
Okay.
I will say, working with horses that have problems, like one of the first things I'm going to do is if there is a noseband, I'm going to take it off. Um,
Okay.
if they have one of your fancy English bridles where you can't take it off, it is a part of the bridle, then I'm going to change headstalls. We're going to put something else on that doesn't have
Okay.
this. I'll tell you from experience that a loose noseband is better than a tight one for sure, but there is
Okay.
still a very measurable difference between a loose noseband and no noseband. So
Mm-hmm.
if I have a horse that has problems, I'm going no noseband. And part of that is that I'm trying to read the horse. I need them to be a part of the conversation and tell me what's going on and how I'm doing. And any form of noseband is going to rob me of some body language from that horse. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so if I'm working with a problem, I need all the information I can have. um,
Gotcha.
I'll say, like, it's not the kind of thing where if I were to watch you, Patrick, riding around and you had a reasonably adjusted cavesson on a horse, and I don't see foamy mouth and triangular eyebrow and pinned ears and tail flip and all, like, this is not the kind of thing that would just scream at me and I wouldn't be able to watch you ride. So I
Mm-hmm.
don't feel that way about them. They're not evil. They have a place. Um, but like if I'm having problems, step one is get the nose band off, because it does rob you of body language from the horse, that if you're going to fix the problem, you need to have all that information there.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
I am I'm pretty much against any form of drop nose band. Like, then there's another step to this that kind of goes into why, but there's no good to come from that. Generally, we're talking about wanting more contact with the bit, or it really is a horse. It's more for a horse that's showing extreme dysfunction, and you don't want that to be visible to the world. And so you put the mask on him where he can't show it. And so to
Mm-hmm.
me, that's always an indication of problems. And I want to get to the root of the problem and solve the problem. I don't want to cover the problem up. So I'm not going to say the noseband necessarily causes the problem. I don't think that's necessarily true. I think it can be, but like the lady had asked a little bit ago, I've forgotten her name, and I was talking about a horse yawning and sticking the tongue out and stuff. If we
Mm-hmm.
have a noseband on that's not extremely loose, they can't do that. So even if we don't really have a problem, if we came across a scenario where the horse needed to release some tension and willingly would have, we prevented him from doing it.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
that's more the perspective that I have. I would rather, especially if I have a young horse and we're likely to have a lot of those light bulb moments, and they're going to want to lick and chew and do those kinds of things. I don't want to ever be in the way of that, or prevent that in any way. So
Mm-hmm.
like if I'm working with dressage riders, or English riders in general, where they're going to have to show in that, we actually, or I advise, we take it off during the week, and then we put it back on Friday before going to the show to let the horse acclimate to it. We show in it, and then we take it right back off. That way,
Mm-hmm.
kind of our default setting is all of the information the horse can give us, and then we do what we have to do to comply with rules when and
Mm-hmm.
where we are.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Something funny
um,
that I think about the horse, the gray horse that's in a lot of the photos that I use. He was educated early on. Almost all of his early education happened without the noseband. And his purpose was to go on and be a dressage horse, and he's made a lovely career as a dressage horse. But his first time wearing the noseband was at a show. And he
Mm.
was really light, really well balanced, and with the loose noseband on, it wiggled enough around, being loose, that he hung his head to stop the wiggle. Like you hear about a hackamore horse will hang the balance
Hmm.
of the hackamore, and this horse hung his nose just slightly behind the vertical to stop that noseband from wiggling. And it's like, damn, there he's behind the vertical now because he was trying to be so light, right? So there was, then after that, it was a couple rides a week. We would ride him with the noseband on to get him just more acclimated to, yep, it's going to move around. You're going to feel that, but that's not something that you have to take personally. And that was all he needed, really, was just a couple rides in that for him to feel better about it. But
Hmm.
I can't help but giggle at how that happened. His first ride in it, he's like, oh, I know how to be soft and balanced. I'll just put myself right here where that doesn't have to influence me. And it's like, oh man, that was just a little too much. So actually, so talking about the outliers that we had mentioned sort of earlier, when we talk about horses learning and how important the nose band is, or how important the mobility of the jaw is, and when we have problems taking off the nose band so that we can get full information relayed to us from the horse, I've seen, and this has been my experience with, I think maybe two horses out of thousands, okay? Two horses that have learned through past experience with really bad hands how to gape their mouth as, I'm going to call it an evasion, but really it was a
Hmm.
trained response to protect themselves. They'd learned to open the mouth. And then at that point, very little communication was even possible. So I did find myself with those two horses, again, out of thousands, with those two horses, that having the nose band on for brief periods, even maybe a little more snug than when we talk about loose adjustment. Like I joke, we don't need that little doorstop tool. You could use your forearm to measure how loose my nose band is, right? So using the nose band to inhibit the horse from overly opening, because it was just such a trained
Hmm.
response, and we're talking it was only for just a couple sessions, right, until the horse
Yeah.
learned then
Yeah.
how to come to the conversation rather than avoid it, like saying they could never talk to me, right, is kind of how they had learned to use their mouth or their jaw. What do you think about something like that? Is that something that you see frequently, or is that something I should have taken a totally different approach?
No, I see it, but not frequently. And it
Mm-hmm.
usually is exactly what you're describing. It's kind of a horse that's been through some stuff that it probably shouldn't have had to go through, and it has some. I don't use this word lightly, but it's got some trauma associated with that stuff,
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
some of those horses, it when I see these horses, that what I want to do to the horse to help it doesn't work. It's always like the 17-year-old that has done this way for so long that when you
Mm-hmm.
start taking away the stuff, they get worse and more insecure. And kind of the kindest thing you can do is just go with what they're used to, and it's unfortunate, uh, but I would still want us to learn the lesson so that the next horse coming down the pipeline, we don't cause that in the first place. It doesn't have to be
Yeah.
that way. But yeah, there are some horses that I think the most humane thing to do is keep them the way that they are, even though it's not what we might want or what would be best for them. But they're just so damaged at that point that you're not going to fix it, and you're probably going to make them a lot more insecure trying to fix it. So it's
Mm-hmm.
just not worth putting them
Mm-hmm.
through that, basically.
Yeah, yeah, and I mean, I don't think trauma was too strong of a word to use there. I think
Yeah.
I think that's pretty appropriate, and I think unfortunately we do see that. Thankfully, that kind of response is not the norm. I think misunderstanding is a lot more the norm than trauma, right? But it's not to say that it's not out there.
Yeah, if the word trauma kind of brought up a little point, if you don't mind me making it here.
Not at
Sometimes
all.
people will refer to what I do as a bit fitter, and I'm not. And I kind of want to say this. Like I heard a podcast with a bit fitter on it not long ago, and she was talking about when we see bone remodeling on the bars. So when they kind of get these little wings
Mm,
on there and so
mm-hmm.
forth, that when she was fitting bits, she didn't have to worry about that too much because horses generally aren't sensitive to it. The part she didn't say out loud is because that horse has nerve damage. He can't feel his
Wow.
bars anymore
Yeah.
because of chronic abuse over a long period of time. So um, that's why I think the understanding, the education behind this stuff is necessary. It's not excusable that he no longer feels pain here. He doesn't feel pain here because he felt so much for so long that the nerves were killed, and that isn't, you're not off the hook for that. Like, that's
Yeah.
that's bad. We don't need to be there. So um, I just wanted to. What I'm doing isn't really bit fitting. Bit fitting is a part of it. We do want a bit that is applicable. I measure mouths. I do all of that stuff. But this is a much more comprehensive picture.
Mm,
It's not just the way that I think about it. If I made a custom pair of shoes for you, that doesn't mean marathons are right around the corner. Like, there's still work that the rider has to be able to do, because it is communication and we're not all necessarily naturally good at that. We still have to work on things and kind of skills of the rider and so forth. Bits are just
mm.
inanimate objects. So are bitless bridles. It is up to the animator to determine whether they work or not.
There you
So,
go. There you go. Yeah, absolutely. And I like what you said. The horse is the final judge. I always like to say the horse gets the final vote, but I think that idea, the horse is the final judge. That really that really drives it home. That's really important to think about. So you mentioned that bit fitting is a part of it, but it's not the whole thing. And I would like to talk about your bitting course here in a minute. But when it comes to bit fitting, and this was a question that came up, are there some important points? Like, do you have here's 5 pieces on my checklist when we look at bit fit or bit fitting? Or, what are your thoughts when it comes to that? Just as a general overview.
um, so one of these may be another hot button topic, but bit fit also involves adjustment of the bridle. And I will say here, this is another one of the points of dogma, is the one wrinkle or two in the corner
Mm-hmm.
of the mouth. Uh, we already mentioned that the lip, and specifically the corner of the mouth, is the very first tissue of the horse to receive a signal from the bit. If we've got 2 wrinkles in the corner of the mouth, then that tissue is constantly receiving a signal from the bit. And that is a signal it's expected to ignore. And that is the textbook definition of desensitized. And so that is not a scenario I ever want to have my horse in. So I adjust bits. Actually, I will make a lot of people uncomfortable when I start. I adjust it like 3/8 of an inch below the corner of the mouth. And that is
Um,
specifically because I want it to annoy the horse so that they pick it up and hold it, just like we were talking about the colt in the round pen. It
Now, is
shouldn't
that
be
because
so
that's
low
where you
like.
want it ultimately, or is that just starting a new conversation with the horse?
Ultimately, I will pick it up a little bit, but I always want it hanging a little bit below the corner. And what will happen there, that's where we're going to get the mouth seal. The horse will grab that bit with their tongue and suck on it. And when they do that, now it's in contact with the corners. But it's in contact in a way that the horse is comfortable with and can control. So I like, this is really a big part of the problems that we see in bits. It's actually just fatigue within the mouth. You think about if you were going shopping
Mm,
with your significant other or something and you have to carry her purse around the mall, you're going to switch hands. You're going to hold it a little differently because you're going to get a little fatigued. And if you have the freedom to be able to make yourself comfortable, you will. If you don't, you're going to get pretty annoyed and not want to hold that thing the next time y'all go shopping. And so that I'm trying
mm,
to give a horse essentially the same opportunity. It's a little bit loose so that you can kind of control it, move it around, suck on it a little differently, put it how you want it, and you're happy with it. And then I'm going to typically have that quiet mouth. So, like, one of the things I'm looking for, and this will generally happen very early, starting a colt, first few days, most of the time. when I go to take the bridle off and I slip it off the pole over the ears, the bit's still in the same place in the mouth. They're holding
Mm-hmm.
the bit. They literally are holding the bit. Like
Yes.
if you don't have that happening, that's a problem. That would be one of the first things that I would want to see. So that's part of bit fit to me. It's adjustment
Mm-hmm.
of the headstall so that the horse isn't being annoyed by the bit, or is annoyed in the right way, maybe is a better way to put it. But we don't have a desensitization issue. Also, if the bit is pulling up into the corners of the mouth a couple of wrinkles, that's mechanically narrowing most bits. If there's any kind of joints in
Oh,
there,
sure.
that bit is also
Mm-hmm.
narrowing, and your headstall is pulling your rings in so that the rings are pushing the cheeks into the first premolars. And so that can be one of those things. Is I can't tell you how many horses, Patrick, and this is not the kind of thing I'm gonna call you out at a clinic or whatever, but if I feel like I have a little rapport with this person, we have a little quiet moment, a few hours in, I'll walk up there and say, "Hey, do you mind if I just loosen your headstall a little bit?" And I'll drop it a couple of I can't tell you how many horses I have seen just lower their head and take a deep breath and just go, "Oh, thank
Yeah.
God." you know,
Yeah.
like they just,
Exactly.
oh, they get so much relief from not having that thing just crammed up into their mouth.
Yeah.
Um, so that's another part of the dogma, and a very underappreciated aspect of bit fit. Um, Another part, so like probably the most common mistake that I see with regard to bit fit is when we have a mouthpiece that is too narrow. That is
Okay.
always going to be a problem. And I will say this is just one of those little anecdotal things, but as we're looking at horses historically, we have a weird phenomenon going on. So if you measure like bits from the 1800s and all, you're going to find a bunch of bits that are not even 5 inches wide. And if you measure jawbones on old skulls, you will find that we have got mouths widening, but the actual bars are narrowing. So essentially, what we have is a horse with a fleshier mouth than what we would have
Mm.
had 100 or 150 years ago, even though their lower jaw is actually a little bit narrower. I'm talking like quarter inch, 3/8 of an inch. So not a
Okay.
huge difference, but enough. It does change the way um, things play out. So that's actually one of the biggest problems that I have with some customers, is that the bit companies are generally not responding to that trend. It can be difficult to find a bit that's like 5.5 inches if you need it. Or I know
Oh, yeah.
some of the English companies have that, but there are lots of times where I'm looking for kind of this specific mouthpiece, but I cannot find an offering of that mouthpiece in the width that I need. And
Yeah.
so that's actually a relatively common problem these days. It's also why I don't like, most of the bit fitters are actually certified under a particular company. So they're like covert
Mm-hmm.
salesmen that are here to sell you
Mm-hmm.
the bit from
Mm-hmm.
XYZ company.
Yeah.
And I want
Similar
the
to a
freedom
saddle
to
fitter
find
that's
what,
working for one
yeah,
brand. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So I want the freedom to be able to buy, search and find whatever bit actually fits this scenario, and not have, well, I'm sorry, but my company doesn't sell that,
Mm-hmm.
so we have
Yeah.
a much more wide open world. I would say that some of the things, like if we're going from a 10 millimeter wide lozenge to a 12 millimeter wide lozenge, like that's the problem 1% of the time. That's not where the big stuff lies. Most of the time, it's more in the adjustment. Is the bit actually wide enough? The dental stuff, boy, that's a big can of worms
Mm.
right there.
Mm-hmm.
I would say it is comparable to the farrier world, in that there are some true masters out there, and there are some people out there that probably should not be doing this for a living anymore. And good luck to the average horse person in figuring out which one you have. So
Yeah. Right.
uh, unlike hooves, if you remove too much tooth, that doesn't just grow back in 6 weeks. That's a problem that's going to persist way,
Mm-hmm.
way longer and cause some pretty horrific problems with the horse. That can be a several years issue. So
Hmm. Hmm. So, do you
I'm
have an
getting off
opinion
on a
on the
tangent
bit
here.
seat that we see some dentists putting in a horse's mouth?
I do. There are actually two kinds of bit seats, and one of them I would say is useless, and the other one I would say it can be pretty important. So if we thought about the premolars coming down and meeting one another, there is a
Hmm.
type of bit seat where they basically put a check in there, so like a little V, half of it in the top tooth and half of it in the bottom tooth, as though the bit
Okay.
would go there. That is useless, and I would probably send whoever did that packing and not allow them to come back. The bit is further away from the premolars than we tend to think, especially adjusted the way I'm doing it. It's
Hmm.
it's a on an average size horse, 15 two-hand horse. It's like your whole finger before you can go from the corner of the mouth to touching the premolars. That does vary horse to horse, but it's like your bit's
Hmm.
not right there near the premolars. Now, if you're
Right.
pulling it back a couple of wrinkles, that makes that one of the things I do is I have a skull and I'll put a rubber band on it to show where the corner of the mouth would be, and then we show what two wrinkles would be, and now you can see the bit relative to the molars and what that actually
Yeah.
changed, and it's a bigger change than people tend to realize
Hmm.
that it is. So if that's what we're calling a bit seat, that's a two thumbs down from me.
Okay.
What we would want to see, if you thought of that premolar, if you're looking at the first premolar, um, it is kind of shaped like the bow of a ship. It's pointed. And what I would want to see for a bit seat is that they're going to go in there and they're going to soften that point. So kind of round it out a little bit. And
Okay.
what that actually does in about half of horses, if roughly, if you'll stick your thumbs in their mouth, and you have a good video of that on YouTube, I know, on
Mm.
the jaw releases where you just put your thumb. If you'll put your thumb in there on that gum tissue, you'll find that the tissue is loose and you can actually
Hmm.
push like a wave of it back. And
Hmm.
so Dr. Tucker is the one that clued me into this. He calls it flabby cheeks just because it's easy to remember. If you have a horse with flabby cheeks and you do apply bar pressure with the bit, you are now sending a wave of gum tissue back into the sharp point of the first premolar. And
That
so
makes
if we
sense.
have that situation and that sharp point exists, I think everybody knows how uncomfortable that would be. So if we can round that,
Hmm.
that's a useful and helpful bit seat. That's the only
Gotcha. So
kind I
you're
would be
talking about
interested in.
rounding, like what would be the lower face of it, not the top, not in
Yes,
a place that changes the occlusion with the upper tooth, but the
exactly.
yeah.
Yep.
Okay. Yep. Yep. That makes a
And
lot of sense.
technically, I'm saying on this, technically the first premolar is the wolf teeth. I'm
Mm.
assuming we're dealing with a horse that doesn't have wolf teeth at this point in time. But
Hmm.
anyway,
Yeah. Yeah. Perfect. Okay. So we've mentioned a couple times your online course at thebitcourse.com. I don't think we've said specifically that that's where it's at. We've talked about the foamy mouth video, right? When people go, I'll put up the link here. When people go to that, thebitcourse.com/foamy hyphen mouth, that's going to give them information about specifically the science into the foamy mouth that you're talking about, correct?
yes. So if they go to the foamy mouth link, they will immediately get a link that'll take them to that video and allow them to watch it. That video is about 30 minutes long. Um,
Okay.
that should give you not only an idea of what the foamy mouth is about, but a feel for the way that I present information, the depth of information, and so forth. So
Mm-hmm.
it's not cursory like you're gonna. I do give people a little bit of this warning. If you go through this course, you're gonna have a hard time watching some people ride from here on. You're gonna see things
Mm-hmm.
that are gonna make you cringe a little bit, and there's
Mm-hmm.
more of that out there than you probably realize at this point in time. Um,
Yeah.
so the course we have two forms. So there's a self-guided form which we just released this past fall, and that allows you access to the original 6 modules of the course. They're kind of broken up in different sections. One's on anatomy, one's on bit fitting, one's on how you use your hands, one is on snaffles specifically, and then there are two that are on curb bits, because curb bits are more complex than we generally tend to
Mm.
realize. Um,
Mm-hmm.
you'll have access to that for about 12 weeks, not for about, for 12 weeks, you will have access to that. It is, and then we also threw in a couple of recordings of the master class where we had special guests. So Dr. Jeff Tucker is one of those,
Ah,
and then Jeremiah Watt, who builds a lot of spade bits. He may sell more spade bits than anybody in North America. Um,
yeah.
so that whole course is something like 15 hours worth of content to go through.
Okay.
And then there's also a 70-page study guide. And so anybody can access that at any point in time and go through that. And for like the casual rider, you will come through that and know more about bits than your trainer does when you get on the other
Mm.
side of it. Don't tell them that, but you're going to know an awful lot.
Right. Right.
We also have a masterclass version. We're about to do one of those courses. I do them quarterly, so we'll have one of those that starts February 16th. The masterclass version, you still have the same course. You have access to it for a year. There is a forum within the course, so you can interact with your fellow participants or ask me questions between meetings and so forth. You'll get access to a module every Sunday evening or Sunday afternoon, and then we will have a Zoom call for the whole group later that week to go over that week's information, and we'll go over the study guide. So usually those calls are 2.5 hours long.
Okay.
I'm not the Cliff Notes guy. I want to make sure
Yeah.
you fully understand what's going on here. And then there's a seventh module with that course, the masterclass course, that I'm actually not even finished with. I'm still at working on it and adding things to it. And it shows a couple of things. One, I'm gonna show you me transitioning a horse out of a snaffle into a shank bit, because that specific transition is the thing I get more questions about than anything else.
Sure.
So I'm going to show you some tricks and things to transition more smoothly right there without problems. And then we're going to go over some of the other apparatus. I almost want to say gimmicks, but just kind of show you the best ways to do the worst things. So things like
Oh,
martingales, draw reins. If
okay.
you wanted to work a horse in sidelines, kind of go over from my perspective. Here's what you might use this for, but here's what you really better watch out for. Here are the cons that
Ah,
can cause you a whole lot of heartache and grief. So if you're going to do this, here's how I would suggest doing it. Here's where I'd suggest stopping, because
yeah.
sometimes
Boy,
that's the
that's
important
important.
part, uh, you know,
Yeah.
before you have problems. And so that's really more aimed at the person that wants to become certified to be a bidding consultant.
Okay.
And we'll kind of show you, some more of that stuff. So the masterclass version is now, that's about 35 hours over 7 weeks. And then you do have
Yeah.
access to all the information for the remainder of the year. At any
Okay.
point in there, if you want to test for certification, there is a written test that you'll have to have a minimum score on, and then you have a Zoom call with me one on one, and I pick your brain and just make sure that you have it.
Mm.
It isn't, there's no extra charge for that. This is not something I'm trying to franchise or anything like that. If you need to
Mm.
take the test multiple times, I'm going to work with you. I want you to understand what's going on. That is the ultimate goal. It's not the kind of thing where I'm trying to be a gatekeeper or fail people or anything
Mm-hmm.
like that. We just want to make sure if you're out there doing this, that you know what you're doing,
Know what
so
you're getting into. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. That's
And
that's awesome. So you have also coming up. If I'm glancing over at your Facebook page right here at a post that you made earlier today, a free online class that you have coming up.
yeah, so it's actually next week. We're going to have, I think, 3 sessions of a webinar, so kind of like you and I are doing, and
Okay.
it is like a PowerPoint presentation. I think we called it 7 ways or something. I should have had that in front of me. That's not very professional, but essentially what it's going to be, we're going to take something out of each of the modules and talk about it. So you get kind of an
Uh,
overview of the content of the course. This is this is one rung on the ladder of what we're trying to show you. And
Gotcha.
let me also say here too, like the number one comment I get from people is I had no idea how much I didn't know about bits. And that's the
Mm-hmm.
biggest thing I think I fight is that people tend to figure, oh, I know enough, or I got this,
Mm-hmm.
and I can almost guarantee you don't know near as much about this topic as you think you do. The other
Mm-hmm.
thing people tend to expect is that it's going to be dry, and it's not. There's a lot of humor in there. It's easy to
I
watch the
wouldn't expect
stuff.
humor from
I'm
you,
being
Daniel.
yeah, I'm being pretty good with you right now, but normally I'm yeah, crossing some lines, and you're not going to fall asleep with me. So uh, it's just like a horse, right? You got to have those little brain breaks where you lick and chew every
Right,
once in a while.
right.
So
If it's anything like your presentation at the Best Horse Practices Summit, where folks who didn't see it, where Daniel turns around and he's got a bit tied in his mouth, and he's got and well, it's funny because you talk about like how much people will say I didn't realize how much I didn't know how much I didn't know, right? One of the things that sticks out to me the most about that presentation, which is funny because you were loaded with so much information, but I cannot get out of my head the walnut and the marker, right? That,
hmm
that you're like, yeah, absolutely. I can still feel it on my tongue thinking about it. It's like, yeah, absolutely. There's so many in that presentation alone. There was so many gems that it was like, well, yeah, of course, and so much of it, like we said in the introduction, where you use the science and you use a lot of common sense. It's like, duh, there was so many moments that were like the light bulb, the switch just needed turned on for the awareness of that thing. There's a lot
hmm
of that information in there that we just don't think about in regards to the horse, but just makes perfect sense when we hear it also. And of course, with the knowledge that you've developed, there's a lot of new things in there to learn as well. But yeah, the humor with that, yeah, absolutely. I don't think anything I'm impressed. You're doing a good job behaving yourself on this, because this is not the adult onset horsemanship podcast. uh, you're doing a
trying to be
fantastic job
respectful
keeping it G.
you and your audience and everything. But yeah, I like a little joke here and there, and
There you go.
keeps us in the parasympathetic, man, where we can learn.
There we
So
go. There we go. There we go. I love it. I love it. Okay, so we've got some pop-ups here for folks that are watching us live or watching the video replay, but for folks that aren't and you're listening to it in podcast form, we've got here thebitcourse.com. That's where folks can find out more information on your bit course. Again, if they are looking for the video to learn about the foamy mouth, we've got thebitcourse.com/foamy dash mouth, and they can find you on Facebook at Dauphin Horsemanship. Is there any other place you'd like folks to look you up? There's a few good resources right there.
we've got our main website is dolphinhorsemanship.com. So you could
Okay.
find that through the Facebook page, or just it's DAUPHIN. I'm pretty late to the newsletter game, but I'm starting to build a newsletter on that. And one of the nifty things I've been doing a walking challenge each month, which gives you a
Yeah.
little course to go try. And it's the kind of thing that would seem deceptively simple until you get in the middle of it and realize that you really don't have a tool to ask your horse to step off with his left hind foot on a consistent basis, or whatever. And that's
Yeah.
kind of how I like to do things. We're going to just give you a little food for thought and a little realization that even though this is simple, you weren't as good at it as you thought you were, and you have a little bit of work to do. And for some of your dressage people, it may not be that challenging. I plan on kind of working them up through the year where they get tougher and tougher and tougher. But
Yeah.
for right now, they're pretty simple. So,
Yeah.
but
Oh, that's
challenging enough
fantastic.
for most.
Yeah. And where do people
So
find out
if you
about that
don't want to
presentation?
just hear me, that's at dolphinhorsemanship.com. If you go on either website, a pop-up will show up a few seconds later, and you just put your email address in there, and that'll automatically get you on the newsletter list and everything. And uh, So, and on the Dauphin Horsemanship one, I don't hammer the bit thing. That's kind of everything else. So if you don't want to hear me drone on and on about bits, that one doesn't do that.
Okay, there we go. Very good. So I've got some wrap up questions here for us, Daniel, and it's not the peanut butter or jelly sort of wrap up questions, right? So it's not something that we have to rush to to give an answer for. But one of them here. Do you have a favorite book, or what are you currently reading?
Uh, I do have some favorite books. To be honest, I'm not currently reading any horse book. I just read a couple for podcast interviews. I would say some classics I have really liked. Lions on Horses, I think, is a really,
Oh, yeah,
really good one.
yeah.
I will say there's a couple things in there he's technically wrong on, knowing what I know now, but it's a good philosophy kind of a way to, and a much easier read than like Ray Hunt or John,
Hmm.
Tom Dorrance's books. You know, it's a little more bubblegum for the brain than trying to decode Yoda. Um, True Horsemanship Through Field, Leslie Desmond and Bill Dorrance's book, I think is one of the greatest books
Yeah.
written. Um, I have read some of the old masters and all that Boucher and that sort of thing. I can't, I haven't in a while, so I'm not, no titles are coming to mind, but yeah, second half Boucher would be a good place to start. I would say that's where a lot of the bit stuff I think kind of started with the jaw flexions and all. And there is some
Oh, okay.
stuff in there that I would disagree with, or I feel like we have bastardized. We kind of took some
Mm,
left turns where we shouldn't have with some of that stuff. But
hmm.
and in terms of what I'm reading, I just read a book that I thought was pretty good. Lynn Acton's book, What Horses Really Want.
Mm,
I liked quite a bit, and she's got some good pictures in there, which I think uh, a lot of horse books don't have great pictures. Some of the older books like have good hand drawn illustrations, but I thought the
hmm.
pictures in her book were really good. I appreciated them from the standpoint of someone who has tried to do a lot of videography and photography of horses and realizes that 99.9% of what you shoot, the light's wrong, the horse was moving, you caught it a half a frame. You know, it's a lot harder to get
Hard.
good pictures and stuff like that yeah, people
Yeah.
realize. So I,
Yeah.
her pictures I thought were outstanding just from that standpoint of knowing how many pictures you have to take to get a good one, you know.
That's
I
great.
really and
That's
truly read more on human psychology now than horse
mm,
stuff, just to be quite frank. That's more the human side of it, how to be an effective teacher, how to get through to people. That's a bigger puzzle to me than the horse, with all due
hmm.
humility. That the horse is not as tricky for me as the person is. So I'm trying to
Yeah.
learn more about the more confusing animal right now.
Right.
But
That's fantastic, and that's so important as a teacher, as a clinician, as someone with kind of a public facing career, right? That is so important. That is so important. So that's great to
mhm.
hear. Where do you see this might be a whole podcast in itself, but um, the elevator version of it? You and I are going up just maybe 5 floors in an elevator. Where do you see the future of horsemanship headed?
I'm this won't be the answer y'all want, but I'm kind of pessimistic and apocalyptic about it right now, with a lot of the legislation and things going on, at least in the U.S. We've had a decline of 40% of the horse population in the U.S. over the last 17 years. So to be frank and candid, I fear whether we're going to have a horse industry in 10 or 15 more years at this point
Mm,
in time. I'm really, if you listen to my podcast, I know I drug you into that a little bit on one. I have a very stewardship of the whole industry mindset right now
mhm.
with regard to kind of some of the flavor of the month stuff and the hyperbolization of some of the language. Like when I use the word trauma, if I use a word like trauma or abuse, I mean the sledgehammer side of the scale, not the jeweler's hammer side of the scale. um,
Yeah.
and I think I think we kind of overemphasize some of that stuff because a lot of people haven't. It's gotten so much better than when you and I were kids and before, that a lot of
Mm-hmm.
people really haven't seen anything bad actually happen at this point. And so when they see something
Mm-hmm.
that's a 2 out of 10, they kind of lose their mind. And it's not to justify, bad's bad, but it, a whole lot worse used to be going on than
Mm-hmm.
what's going on. We've made a ton of improvement in the welfare of horses. And I would say we've even gone so far that there are now things that we consider best practices that are actually more detrimental to horses than we have any concept of. Um,
Mm.
like just keeping
Do you
them in
think
a
it's a
stall,
swinging of the
I mean,
pendulum?
I hope. I mean, again, we're
Yeah.
now, some of the things that have happened in the Olympics and other deals, like we have the spotlight of people who don't know anything about horses looking at us now. And
Mm-hmm.
I hope we have the opportunity for the pendulum to come back towards center. I'm not convinced we
Mm-hmm.
will, but
Mm-hmm.
I do follow the legislation and stuff, and we've had some serious near misses. I don't know if you want to get into that, but I'll just say very quickly, like the PAST Act and the Horse Protection Act that just was supposed to go into effect in February. And I know we're probably talking to an international audience here, but the head veterinarian in charge of APHIS, the USDA group that's writing the rules and all on how they're going to do this, he has said, and I have multiple people confirming this, that any act of riding a horse could legally be considered soaring under their new rules. And so people are looking at that and they're thinking of the horrific things that are claimed with the gaited horses, but
Mm-hmm.
the same law, the guy in charge of running it is saying any riding of a horse he would consider soaring and enforce against us. And like I say, I know it's not fun to talk about, but there's some pretty scary stuff on the horizon right now if things go the wrong way in a few instances. So
Mm-hmm. Yeah. If folks want to
there we
look
go.
into that more for more education and maybe, who to talk to, what to do, is there a reference that you can give for folks, someplace to look?
I've done several podcasts on it. I would encourage you to look for the one that has a group called Western Justice. So that's Dave Duquette and Colton Woods were involved in that latest
Mm-hmm.
podcast that was done in the fall. If you just follow the group Western Justice, I know Dave may be a strong flavor for some people, but just listen to the facts and the things that are like the whole statistic that we've lost 40% of the horses in the country in the
Mm-hmm.
last 17 years. That should scare people, and I keep saying it because I know most people aren't aware of it, and I've yet to scare anyone with it. And I mean, if 40% of the bald eagles in the country had died in the last 17 years, like, you
Mm-hmm.
wouldn't be able to drive a truck anymore or something. We'd have made major changes on the
Major
horizon.
changes. Yeah.
So
Right.
yeah,
Right.
and we just seem to be heading toward a cliff on this, and nobody's listening. So anyway,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Western Justice, I would advise you to check
Western
them out, even
Justice.
if you're an English writer, which I'm sure most of your audience is. They're kind of they're the only group I'm aware of that's actually battling the lobbyists that are trying to shut us down. There are multiple
Mm-hmm.
other horse groups like the American Horse Council and even the USDF, DF, and all that I feel like are asleep at the wheel. They don't realize we're in a war, and we are, and they're not fighting like they should be fighting for. The noseband door stopper thing, I think, is the like, you just threw a squirt bottle at a fire. I mean, you
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
wasn't wasn't what we needed you to do. But
Mm-hmm.
anyway.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, gotcha. Well, Western Justice. That's definitely something for folks to look into. So, what's one thing that you could? I'm gonna shift our focus just for a moment with this.
Yeah,
What's one
puppies,
thing for?
unicorns.
Yeah, exactly. Right. What's one thing for riders to work on or think about to make their horsemanship better this week?
Slow your hands down. And when I say slow your hands down, I mean a tenth of the speed that you're moving them right now. Like, look at that as you're approaching something dangerous, and you should do it cautiously and meticulously. And you'll start to find that line, and then you can approach it quicker. But 98% of people do not know where that line is, and they cross it obliviously. So like what I'm talking about is feel when you make contact with the lip, feel when you make contact with the tongue, feel as you're compressing those soft tissues towards the bars. If you are not currently aware of that, and I know most people aren't, it will be a major game changer in the way you ride and the picture you present. Like, your horse will be tension free now as you're riding them, rather than bracing against you with a neck like concrete. It's a big deal. Very, very big deal. Slow down.
Yeah, slow down. Exactly. And when you think you're slow enough, slow down even more, right? That's
Yep.
Yeah, great advice. So I used to listen to a lot of Tim Ferriss podcasts, and he had a question that he used as a wrap up that I've got to give him credit because I think it's a great question. If you had a billboard to print a message big enough for the whole world to see, what would it say?
Ooh. Yeah, that's a minor thing. Send more money. Let's see. I would probably say something along the lines of, "Have you made someone else laugh today?" That's
Mm,
probably what I would do. I wield the humor thing. I haven't done it very well on this podcast, but I wield that with a sword most of the time, and it is a powerful, powerful tool. And we
yes.
should all take it as a challenge to make someone else laugh today.
I love it. I think that's great. Where I know that you and I have both had a couple occasions for a giggle in this conversation. So mission accomplished, at least as far as today goes, right? So I think that's
Yep.
great. Have you made someone laugh today? I love that. That's fantastic. Well, Daniel, thank you so much for joining me for episode 59 here of Talking About Horses. And I want to again recommend that folks look you up at thebitcourse.com and dauphinhorsemanship.com, as well as on Facebook, Dauphin Horsemanship. Thank you. Thank you so much. This has been an absolute pleasure to chat with you, as always.
Well, thank you, Patrick. I appreciate you coming on. And the answer to the question earlier, who's chocolate and who's peanut butter? Well, you are the 6 shots of espresso guy, so you got to be the bean side of that equation. There's just no two ways about it, right? So,
Fair enough. Fair enough. I love it. All right. Well, thank you so much, Daniel. And thank you, gang, for tuning in. Whether you listened live or you're listening to the replay, we really appreciate you being here with us. Thanks, gang.